So I'm going to argue here that one of the best examples of how to think about organizational data security, things like access control, defense in depth, and how you handle security leaks, comes not from security theory or academia, but or even case studies, but from spy media. Specifically Hitchcock spy movies. And this isn't that as far-fetched as it might sound at first, because the idea of making sure the Germans or the Nazis didn't discover informational secrets in the UK from Britain during the Battle of Britain was ingrained not just in the popular culture at the time, but also in just the general culture, because the idea was that any information would be useful to the Nazis. It wasn't just military and top secret information, but information about shifts in a factory, information about how production was going on a production line. All of that was valuable information to an adversary. So most of the people who had been watching like Hitchcock's World War II movies, or like the movies that were made immediately after, would have been intimately familiar with the idea of containment, of making sure that only the people who needed to know were allowed to know, because the more loose lips sink ships. The more people know, the more likely it is the adversary finds things out. So when you look at something like Notorious, made in 1946, in the immediate aftermath of World War II, you would have to remember that the audience at the time kind of knew what was needed to make sure an enemy didn't find out the dangerous information. So if you aren't familiar, you should absolutely watch it. It's Notorious is one of the best examples of a Hitchcock thriller. Got Cary Grant and Ingrid Bergman as the leads. Cary Grant is the American spy. Ingrid Bergman is the daughter of a notorious Nazi traitor, and he convinces her to, by certain means, infiltrate a group of Nazis that have managed to flee after the war. Because they know that the Nazis are planning something. Nazis always do. They're always planning something. And he would... it was vital for the national security of the US and other countries to discover what that was and prevent it. And from the perspective of immediately, that is a good first example of operational security and data security, which is that the Nazi group that Ingrid Bergman is supposed to infiltrate make sure that the vital strategic data that they're protecting is only accessible from within the organization. They're not keeping it in a mailbox or safety deposit box in London or somewhere that the Allied nations or the US can access it. They make sure it's stored somewhere away from where adversarial authorities can store it. And the same applies if you're worried about something like, the US. You don't store it on a US-based server or with a US-based company. And this is not a new concern. Throughout my career, from the time I got my first job at a software company, there's been this concern about the safety or security of whichever data you store with a US server, and that comes down to George Bush, Patriot Act, and the laws that followed that essentially mean that you can pretty much trust that if the US authorities are interested in any given piece of data that's stored with a US-based company or in a US-based server, that they will be able to access it. That's kind of what the law is for. And the thing that a lot of people warned about at the time was that we don't always know that the US government will respect whatever safeguards they might have in place, that this was proto-fascism, like the first step towards like the mechanisms of fascism, even though you might not have an actual fascist movement behind it. That's kind of what's happened now. And it also goes to show that one key difference between the security concerns of a European company or organization today versus 20 years ago, which is that when I was working in like a software security company based here in Iceland, and they hosted all of their data in a Icelandic data center. They didn't store it in the US-based one specifically because they were worried about the Patriot Act. One of the things that they didn't have to worry about at the time were zealots or converts. But like, you wouldn't have an Icelander or a European suddenly convert to Bushism and think that the ideals of following George Bush would trump their own current national interest or the interest of the company or company they're working for or the colleagues they were on. But today, there is a decent chance that if somebody had lent towards authoritarianism and authoritarian ideas, had sympathies to fascist ideology, that they might see the rise of Trumpism as something that they can relate to. It's a very real possibility that a security leak would not necessarily come from accidentally hiring a North Korean agent or hiring an undercover agent or infiltration, such as the Nazis were facing in Notorious, but from somebody who has been working for an organization who suddenly believes that the cause of Trumpism, is more important than the organization they work for, the country they belong to, or their colleagues that work around them. So the infiltration isn't just the unfamiliar or the new or an employee or manager getting hacked. It potentially is converts, zealotry. And that's an aspect of this that wasn't the case 20 years ago, 10 years ago. You didn't really have to worry about somebody in your organization suddenly converting to Putinism or becoming a Chinese sympathizer overnight. But there has always been a contingent among tech that lent towards fascism and authoritarianism. And I remember this, conversations in companies where I used to work, where you'd ask people, like a developer, what they were reading and, or talk to them about politics. And you'd like, that's kind of fascist. And you'd think that to yourself, because saying that out loud would just lead to an argument. But which means that the first step, the safeguarding against infiltration, is something that is an actual concern. You need to actually worry about somebody inside your organization turning, because it's not, and also it's not just the converts. It's like the accidentally hiring a North Korean agent is something that has happened to software development companies, and having an executive's phone or email account hacked and then becoming an unwitting infiltrator is something that happened. It happened to Microsoft, so it's definitely possible for it to happen to you, to your organization. So the first step, which is the same if you following the playbook of the Nazis in Notorious, is access control, which is that even though Ingrid Bergman managed to infiltrate herself into the household of the Nazi played by Claude Rains, she didn't have access to everything, all of the secrets of the organization immediately. And the same thing applies. Just because somebody works for you or is a manager or is allowed in your office, that doesn't mean they should have access to everything. Access to any given database in your company should only be to or open to those who need to access it. Even like a developer who says, I need to work with it. No, they don't need to work with a database. They need to work with something that looks and works like the database. They should never ever touch actual customer or client data, because you don't know what they're going to do with it. And sometimes they could even accidentally leak it. And that's honestly just as bad, because when it comes to like regulatory compliance and your duty and obligation to report security issues, they don't care how it happens. Even if it's unintentional or not, you still need to report it. So it still exposes you to liability and issues. So the next step after the access control is like with the Nazis. Well, the first step was making sure that it's not stored, the data and the information is not stored where the Americans or the adversary can access it. Second step was access control. The third step is also important, which is to make sure that you don't store what you don't need. There's a lot of this goes unsaid in the movie, but they make sure that they don't name names. They don't store too much detail because they know that anything that can get stored gets leaked. And the same thing applies to us when we're developing software or an organization. The data that you don't store doesn't get leaked. It doesn't get stolen. It doesn't get confiscated or accessed through a warrant by an American organization who've just criminalized a section of their population and are wanting to use you to find people to arrest. So if you don't store that data, you're not going to be a target. And the second thing, which is also comes from the Nazi organization playbook, in that they organized into cells, where each cell, the data that was contained with each cell wouldn't be collected in a central point, because then, as each cell, spy cell was discovered, only what they didn't know enough to harm the rest of the organization. And in terms of business strategy, you can think of that as data should be stored where it can be acted upon. It shouldn't. The more data you control centrally, the further away it is from where it can be acted upon, which is a bad idea anyway. But centrally storing all of your data makes you a target. It makes you a lucrative target for whoever and whichever. But the closer you store the data to where it's acted upon, the tighter the feedback loop is for that part of the organization, and that the faster decisions can be made. So it's not just a security issue to push the information you store and store them at the edges rather than the center. It's an actual organizational functional issue. It's a question of maneuverability. Storing information at the edges makes an organization more limber, more actionable. And one example of this were chains of bookstores. One of the issues that bookstore chains in the UK, for example, had was that for many of them, the purchases for any given bookstore were decided upon centrally, and like they collected all of their purchase data into one big pool, and then some hoity-toity manager decided that this bookstore would buy that, this bookstore would buy that. But the people on the ground have a much better sense of, just because your bookstore is at a train station doesn't mean that it should order the same books as another bookstore, another train station. It depends on what sort of customers come in on a regular basis. So when Daunt, who now runs, for example, Waterstones, one of the first things that he did, if I remember correctly, once he took over management of Waterstones, was he made sure that purchase decisions for the bookstores were made in each branch, and that meant that they would be able to focus their purchase decisions based on their actual clientele, but also respond to changes much more quickly. And from the perspective of your average business organization, the logical next step is that for all non-essential data, all data that doesn't have to go and be stored centrally, that it's only stored at the edges, in the branch, in the office where it's needed, and not stored centrally. That obviously is not going to apply to everything, and it's not going to, you're not going to be able to apply this idea to every single piece of data you store, but it applies to more than you'd think. And in the software world, if you're making software, making an app, the equivalent there would be to store things in the client, store things in, whether it's in the browser or in the in the app or in the user's file system. Anything that they store and they control is something that they can act upon much quicker, more reliably, but also means that it doesn't make you a target. It's much harder for an attacker to go through all of the edge locations and gather the data one by one. And anything that slows them down gives you time, and anything that gives you time makes you more able to react, more able to do the right thing, and protect your own interest. It's not an ideology. It's pure pragmatism. There are liability issues for a European company if an outside entity accesses private data. It doesn't matter if it's the US government or some fascist-leaning employee who leaks whatever to whatever ultra right-wing website is on vogue at each time. And following on from that, you also, obviously, if you have to store the data, make sure you can actually delete it. Or technically, you don't need to actually delete it, because that can be a difficult thing for distributed storage. But if you encrypt something and store it, and store the encryption key separately for each user, then deleting the key means you've effectively shredded the entire data for that user. So it's not just you can making sure that the data is impossible to access is almost as good as actually deleting it, because it can come down to effectively the same thing. And this fits in with the classic spy trope of self-destructing messages and throwing papers into the fire and shredding it. It's a trope for a reason. You want to be able to cut this off. But the final lesson is actually what is the downfall of the Nazi organization in Notorious. You see, one of the recurring themes for authoritarians, both in media and in real life, is the need to command and control, the rule through fear and discipline, and the treatment of people as cogs in a machine. And doesn't matter whether it's Star Wars or Notorious, the standard tactic is that anybody who shows weakness is punished. And this is actually surprisingly common in how we run businesses today. Performance reviews. Also, like when you have the circumstance where you a percentage of the company can expect to get fired basically every year, and at the same time you have performance reviews and you have management reports, and anybody who shows any kind of weakness or mistake or flaw can expect to be at risk at losing their job. And the same thing happens in Notorious. The Nazis kill everybody who shows any weakness. And that means that when the Claude Rains character starts to suspect Ingrid Bergman, his wife who has infiltrated his organization, he doesn't report it. Even though that's what you should do whenever there's something happens where you suspect that your organization or your business has been infiltrated, whether it's you accidentally clicked a link or in the email and your computer started to behave weirdly, or whether that new employee is doing weird things or whatever. You're supposed to report it because that's the only way the organization can actually prevent bad things from happening. But if you punish the people who report, like the Nazis in Notorious, they killed people who showed any weakness, that meant that the Claude Rains character's first instinct was to prevent the infiltration from being discovered and try to handle it himself. And that meant that instead of immediately shutting down the security risk and preventing, basically ensuring victory for the Nazi saboteurs in Notorious, he ensured their doom because he was afraid. His fear of discovery, or of him being purged for having made an understandable human error, meant that the good side won. And this is the thing that the authoritarians never understand. They never grasp, which is that this iron fist control over the organizations, this rule through fear and weeding out weakness, actually makes the organization weak. Robust organizations understand that people make mistakes, that people vary, and that it's the system of the organization that is the actual decider of the overall productivity or effectiveness of the organization. The organization that understands that people make mistakes and makes sure it's a safe enough environment for them to let you know that something has gone wrong. That's the organization that lasts, that tolerates crises and survives them. The authoritarian organizations that weed out weakness create weakness in themselves, because you're always going to need people, and people will always make human errors. So you need to create an environment that benefits from human variation, that from people noticing the odd and the strange and the weird. You want people to be human and let you know when they see something. But that's not what authoritarians want, or managers with an authoritarian bent. And that's why they lose in the long run. That's why the rest of us will win eventually.